While 38 slave catchers drank cheap whiskey and shared stories of their successful hunts in the saloons of Houston, Corpus Christi, and San Antonio, no one noticed the 34-year-old enslaved woman silently observing their patterns, memorizing their faces, mentally noting their routes. Her name was Dorcas Miller. She worked as a washerwoman traveling between 3 Texas cities, and during the autumn of 1859, she would transform a silly trick from childhood, something so simple that white men laughed when they first heard about it, into one of the most efficient killing sprees in American slave resistance history. In 11 nights between September and October, 38 professional slave catchers would die in almost identical ways, apparently from foolish accidents. But there was nothing foolish about it. There was only Dorcas Miller, her superior intelligence, her photographic memory for faces and routes, and a profound understanding of something every slave catcher ignored: arrogance kills faster than any poison. The story began 6 months earlier, in March of 1859, when the slave catchers made the fatal mistake that would transform a silent washerwoman into their own walking death. They captured her 16-year-old daughter, Mercy, just 3 miles from the Mexican border. Mercy was pregnant. She was free, and they raped her, dragged her back to Texas in chains, and sold her to a cotton plantation near Galveston, where the overseer whipped her until she lost the baby. Mercy died from infection 1 week later, alone, calling for her mother. When Dorcas learned this, she did not scream. She did not cry in public. She made no threats. She simply began to observe, to memorize, to plan, and to prepare the silly trick that would kill every man who had touched her daughter, plus every other slave catcher she encountered along the way. Dorcas Miller was born in 1825 on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, the daughter of an enslaved mother named Patience and a white overseer whose name she never spoke. Her mixed-race appearance, lighter brown skin, hazel eyes, and wavy hair would become both curse and weapon throughout her life. In Virginia, it marked her for special attention from masters and overseers. In Texas, it allowed her to move through white spaces with less suspicion than darker-skinned slaves could manage. She was sold away from her mother at age 7, part of a mass liquidation when her Virginia master died bankrupt. A slave trader named Jeremiah Whitlock purchased her along with 43 others and marched them southwest in a coffle, iron collars connected by chains, through Tennessee, Arkansas, and finally to the newly annexed Republic of Texas in 1836. Dorcas was 11 years old when she arrived in Houston, a raw frontier town that smelled of mud, horse manure, and the desperate ambitions of men seeking fortunes in a place where human bondage was the foundation of every dream. She was purchased by Cornelius Ashford, a merchant who owned a general store and a small cotton operation outside Houston. Ashford discovered quickly that Dorcas possessed an unusual mind. She learned to read by studying product labels and newspapers left around the store. She taught herself arithmetic by counting inventory. She memorized faces after seeing them once. She understood patterns, weather patterns, customer patterns, seasonal patterns, human patterns, with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. By age 16, she had become Ashford's most valuable asset. She managed his store inventory, predicted market demands with uncanny accuracy, and handled complex transactions with both white and free black customers. Ashford, who considered himself an enlightened master, allowed her unusual freedoms. She could move through Houston relatively unsupervised. She could interact with free blacks and even some whites. She could earn small amounts of money doing laundry on Sundays. It was during this period that she met Samuel, a free black carpenter from Louisiana who had purchased his own freedom after 15 years of saving. Samuel was 42, weathered and wise, with hands that could build anything and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He had come to Texas following rumors of better opportunities for free blacks in the frontier territories. Those rumors, like most rumors about Texas, were lies. But he stayed, and he met Dorcas, and against all odds they fell in love. Texas law prohibited marriages between enslaved and free blacks, but in the informal communities of Houston's black neighborhoods, such marriages happened anyway. Samuel and Dorcas were married in a quiet ceremony in 1842, blessed by an elderly enslaved preacher named Ezekiel, who risked whipping to perform such rituals. Cornelius Ashford, in one of his periodic displays of benevolence, allowed the union, seeing Samuel as a stabilizing influence who might keep Dorcas content and productive. Their daughter Mercy was born in 1843. She inherited Dorcas's intelligence and Samuel's quiet strength. Because her father was legally free, Mercy existed in a strange liminal space, not quite enslaved, not quite free. Her status perpetually uncertain under Texas's chaotic and contradictory laws regarding slave children with free black fathers. Ashford, demonstrating unusual restraint, allowed Mercy to live with both parents and never sold her, though he legally could have at any moment. For 16 years, Dorcas built a life within the crushing limitations of bondage. She raised Mercy with fierce determination, teaching her to read in secret, teaching her carpentry from Samuel, teaching her the most important lesson of all: never let them see your mind. The intelligent slave, the educated slave, the questioning slave, these were the ones who faced the harshest punishments. So Mercy learned to appear simple while harboring brilliance. She learned her mother's trick of observation, her father's patience, and she learned to dream of something her mother had stopped dreaming of decades ago: freedom. In 1858, when Mercy turned 15, Samuel made a decision that would cascade into tragedy. He had saved enough money, earned through carpentry work, careful investments, and a lifetime of deprivation, to purchase Mercy's freedom. Texas law, in its labyrinthine complexity, technically allowed free blacks to purchase enslaved relatives from willing masters. Ashford, aging and increasingly influenced by his abolitionist-leaning daughter, who had returned from schooling in Massachusetts, agreed to the sale. The price was $800, an astronomical sum that represented every cent Samuel had earned in 23 years of freedom. The transaction was completed in February of 1859. Mercy Miller became legally free. The documents were properly filed with the Harris County Courthouse. Samuel cried for the first time in decades. Dorcas allowed herself, for one dangerous moment, to hope. Mercy's plan was simple. She would travel to Mexico, just 150 miles south, where slavery had been abolished since 1829. Once safely across the border, she would find work, save money, and eventually purchase her mother's freedom. Samuel would follow within a year, and the family would reunite in a country where they could live as human beings rather than property. It was a good plan. It was a possible plan. It was the kind of plan that thousands of enslaved people and free blacks dreamed of every night. Mercy left Houston on March 3, 1859, accompanied by 2 free black families also heading south. They traveled on foot, following established routes through the Texas coastal plain, moving mostly at night to avoid slave patrols, but traveling by day when passing through areas known to be relatively safe. They carried Mercy's freedom papers, carefully preserved in an oilskin pouch. Those papers were her shield, her weapon, her proof of humanity. On March 7th, just 3 miles from the Rio Grande, so close to freedom that Mercy later told her parents she could smell the difference in the air, they were stopped by a group of 7 slave catchers operating under the leadership of a man named Cyrus Blackwood. Slave catching was one of the most profitable businesses in the antebellum South, but it reached its most vicious expression in Texas. The state's proximity to Mexico, where slavery was illegal, made it a constant battleground between freedom seekers and those who hunted them for bounty. Slave catchers in Texas operated with near-total impunity. They could stop any black person and demand proof of freedom. They could claim any black person was a runaway slave, and the burden of proof fell entirely on the accused. They could kill black people who resisted and face no legal consequences. They could rape, torture, and brutalize with the full protection of Texas law. Cyrus Blackwood was 38 years old, a former overseer from Alabama who had discovered that hunting humans paid better than supervising them. He operated with a crew of 6 other men, all equally brutal, all equally protected by the legal and social structures of the slave South. They specialized in capturing runaways near the Mexican border, but they had expanded their business model to include something even more profitable: capturing free blacks with legitimate papers, destroying those papers, and selling the victims back into slavery in distant states where no one could verify their status. When Blackwood stopped Mercy and her companions, she presented her freedom papers immediately. She was calm. She was prepared. She knew her rights, or at least she knew what rights the law theoretically granted her. Blackwood examined the papers, smiled, and tore them into pieces. Then he had his men seize all 5 travelers. What happened next was documented in fragments through witness testimony that would later surface in abolitionist newspapers and court records. The 2 free black families, a total of 4 adults and 3 children, were bound with ropes and forced to watch as Blackwood and 3 of his men raped Mercy repeatedly over the course of 2 hours. One of the men, a slave catcher named William Sutton, remarked that "this one's pretty enough for New Orleans," suggesting they planned to sell her to one of the city's notorious fancy girl markets, where light-skinned enslaved women were sold specifically for sexual exploitation. But Mercy fought. She was her mother's daughter, her father's daughter, and she fought with a ferocity that surprised the men. She managed to grab a knife from one of the catchers and slashed Blackwood across the face, leaving a deep cut from his left eye to his jaw. Enraged, Blackwood beat her with a rifle butt until she stopped moving. Then he had his men chain all the captives and force-march them north, back into Texas, back into slavery. The 2 families were sold in Houston within a week. Distributed to different buyers, the children separated from parents with the casual cruelty that characterized the domestic slave trade. Mercy was sold to a cotton plantation called Riverside, 40 miles inland from Galveston, owned by a man named Thurston Pemberton. Pemberton was one of the wealthiest plantation owners in southeast Texas, with 400 acres under cotton cultivation and 87 enslaved people working his fields. His overseer, a sadist named Horace Finch, had a reputation that spread throughout the region. He believed that enslaved people were like mules. They required breaking before they could work properly. When Mercy arrived at Riverside, she was 3 months pregnant from the rapes. Finch discovered this within days and informed Pemberton, who made a cold economic calculation. A pregnant slave girl would be less productive in the fields. Therefore, the pregnancy must be ended. Finch was authorized to take whatever measures necessary. On March 23, 1859, Horace Finch had Mercy tied to the whipping post in the center of the slave quarters. The other enslaved people were forced to watch, as they always were, as Finch wanted witnesses to understand what resistance brought. He used a bullwhip, the kind designed for breaking horses, with a 6-foot braided leather lash ending in a metal tip called a cracker. He delivered 40 lashes to Mercy's back, each one delivered with full strength, each one tearing skin and muscle, each one aimed with practiced precision to maximize pain and damage. Mercy lost the baby that night. She hemorrhaged for 3 days. She developed a fever from infection, her wounds turning septic in the filthy conditions of the slave quarters. The plantation had no doctor. Pemberton considered medical care for slaves an unnecessary expense, and the elderly enslaved woman who served as the quarter's healer had only limited supplies of herbs and clean cloth. Mercy Miller died on March 30th, 1859, 27 days after leaving Houston with dreams of freedom, 3 miles from safety, destroyed by men who faced no legal consequences for rape, kidnapping, and murder. She was 16 years old. Her final words, whispered to the healer who sat with her, were, "Tell Mama I'm sorry. Tell Mama I tried." News traveled through the underground networks of enslaved and free black communities with remarkable speed. By April 5th, Samuel had learned his daughter was at Riverside Plantation. By April 8th, he had traveled there and pleaded with Pemberton to see her. Pemberton informed him with casual indifference that the girl had died of fever and been buried in the plantation's slave cemetery, an unmarked plot where dozens of bodies decomposed in shallow graves. Samuel returned to Houston on April 10th and told Dorcas everything he had learned. She listened in complete silence. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply sat motionless for 6 hours, and Samuel later told friends that watching Dorcas in those hours was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. Something died in her that day, he said, but something else was born, something cold and calculating and absolutely merciless. The next morning, Dorcas went to work as usual at Cornelius Ashford's store. She smiled at customers, she counted inventory, she appeared completely normal. But inside, she was conducting a different kind of inventory, an inventory of slave catchers. Texas, in 1859, had an estimated 200 active slave catchers, but approximately 40 operated regularly in the Houston-Galveston-San Antonio corridor. Dorcas, through her work at Ashford's store and her extensive network in Houston's black community, knew many of them by sight. She knew where they drank, she knew their routes, she knew their patterns, and she knew their weakness, arrogance. Slave catchers believed themselves invincible. They operated with absolute confidence in their legal immunity and their physical dominance. They believed black people, especially enslaved black women, were inferior, helpless, and incapable of strategic thinking. This belief would kill them. Dorcas spent April and May gathering intelligence. She moved through Houston's streets with her usual discretion, but now every interaction had purpose. She listened to slave catchers boasting in saloons about their captures. She noted which catchers traveled alone versus in groups. She learned their schedules, their preferred routes, their habits. She created a mental map of their movements with the same precision she applied to Ashford's inventory. And she remembered a trick from childhood, something so simple that it seemed almost ridiculous. When Dorcas was 8 years old, during the terrible march from Virginia to Texas, an elderly enslaved man named Josiah had taught her and the other children a game to pass the time during their forced journey. The game involved carefully placing small, sharp objects, thorns, broken glass, sharp stones, in patterns along roads. The idea was to create invisible traps that would puncture feet or horse hooves. It was just a game, a way to give children something to focus on besides their suffering. But Josiah, who had been a blacksmith before his enslavement, explained that during the Haitian Revolution, enslaved rebels had used similar tactics to devastating effect, creating fields of concealed sharpened bamboo stakes called devil's thorns that crippled French cavalry and infantry. The trick was deceptively simple. Take a sharp object, position it point up, conceal it in a way that made it invisible in darkness or shadow, and place it somewhere a target would step with full weight. In grass, in mud, in sand, in darkness, the traps were nearly undetectable until it was too late. A single puncture wound from a dirty, sharp object in the pre-antibiotic era could lead to tetanus, lockjaw, sepsis, and death within days. Dorcas began experimenting in June. She collected materials with obsessive care. Large thorns from honey locust trees, which could grow 4 inches long and were hard as nails. Broken glass fragments from behind saloons, which she sharpened further using stones. Long iron nails stolen one at a time from Ashford's store. She learned to treat each item with specific substances. She dipped thorns in horse manure, knowing it carried tetanus. She coated glass shards with material from infected wounds that she encountered while washing blood-stained clothes. She prepared iron nails by allowing them to rust in filthy water. She practiced placement techniques obsessively. She tested different angles, different concealment methods, different locations. She learned that loose sand near riverbanks was ideal. The thorns, or glass, could be pushed point up into the sand, completely invisible, positioned along the narrow paths that ran along the riverbank. She learned that tall grass near creek crossings worked perfectly. She learned that the muddy areas near watering holes, where horses naturally slowed down and men often dismounted, were ideal killing zones. By August, she was ready to begin. Her target selection was methodical. She started with the 7 men who had captured Mercy, Cyrus Blackwood and his crew. Through careful observation, she learned their patterns. Blackwood's crew operated primarily along the roads between Houston and the Mexican border, but they returned to Houston every 10 to 14 days to sell their captives and spend their blood money in the city's saloons and brothels. Dorcas learned that Blackwood's favorite saloon was the Red River Tavern, a notorious establishment near the docks. She learned that he typically left the tavern between 10 and 11 at night, drunk, and walked alone to a boarding house 3 blocks away. His route took him along a narrow path beside Buffalo Bayou, a creek that ran through Houston. The path was unpaved, muddy, bordered by tall grass and brush, and completely unlit at night. On September 7th, 1859, Dorcas prepared her first trap. She spent 2 hours that afternoon carefully planting 43 honey locust thorns, each 4 inches long, each treated with horse manure and positioned point up in the mud along a 30-foot stretch of the path. She concealed them perfectly, testing each one to ensure it was stable and would not tip over when stepped on. She positioned them in a pattern that was nearly impossible to avoid. Stepping anywhere within a 2-foot-wide band of the path would result in puncture. That night, Cyrus Blackwood left the Red River Tavern at 10:30, drunk on whiskey and arrogant as always. He walked his usual route, alone, in darkness. He stepped onto the trapped section of path and immediately felt the first thorn punch through his boot sole and deep into his foot. He jerked back and stepped on 3 more. He tried to move forward and stepped on 5 more. In the darkness, drunk and confused, he could not see what was happening. He only knew that something was stabbing him repeatedly through his boots. He stumbled off the path and into the bayou, where the water was 4 feet deep and the bottom was soft mud. This was exactly what Dorcas had predicted. She had studied human panic responses and knew that people who step on sharp objects in darkness instinctively move toward what they perceive as clear ground, even if it means stepping into water. Blackwood thrashed in the water, screaming in pain and confusion. He managed to drag himself out on the opposite bank, but by then he had driven thorns deeper into his feet with every movement, and he had swallowed bayou water thick with sewage and animal waste. He crawled 200 yards to a nearby house and pounded on the door, screaming for help. The residents, a white merchant family, found him bleeding and incoherent. They pulled 11 thorns from his feet, each one deeply embedded, each puncture wound filthy with mud and contaminated water. They bandaged him and called for a doctor. The doctor arrived the next morning, examined the wounds, cleaned them as best he could with the limited medical knowledge of the era, and prescribed rest. Within 3 days, Blackwood developed a fever. Within 5 days, his jaw began to stiffen, the first symptom of tetanus. Within 7 days, he was experiencing the full horror of lockjaw. His muscles contracted uncontrollably, his back arched into a rigid bridge, his jaw locked shut so tightly that his teeth cracked, and he screamed in wordless agony through clenched teeth for hours, until he finally suffocated from respiratory muscle paralysis. Cyrus Blackwood died on September 14, 1859, 7 days after stepping on Dorcas Miller's thorns. The official cause of death was recorded as lockjaw from accidental injury. No one suspected murder, no one investigated, no one even wondered. It was simply one of those unfortunate accidents that happened in a frontier town where sanitation was poor and medical care was primitive. Dorcas watched his funeral from a distance, standing among a crowd of black workers who had gathered out of curiosity. She felt nothing except cold satisfaction. 1 down, 37 to go. The other 6 members of Blackwood's crew were easier. William Sutton, the man who had suggested selling Mercy to New Orleans, died on September 19th from identical symptoms. He had walked drunk through a different section of Buffalo Bayou, where Dorcas had planted thorns along the entire shoreline path. Jacob Reeves, who had held Mercy down during the rapes, died on September 23rd after his horse stepped on concealed glass fragments near a watering hole outside San Antonio. The horse threw him. He landed on more glass, and sepsis killed him within a week. The pattern continued through late September. Marcus Finley died from infection after stepping on thorns near Corpus Christi. Daniel Shaw died from tetanus after a thorn punctured his foot while he was dismounting his horse. Thomas Warfield died from blood poisoning after a glass shard cut his foot. Benjamin Cole died from lockjaw after thorns pierced both feet. By October 1st, all 7 men who had captured Mercy were dead. Each death appeared accidental. Each death was attributed to bad luck and poor frontier sanitation. No one connected them. No one suspected a pattern. But Dorcas was not finished. She had learned something important during those first 7 killings. Slave catchers talked. They gossiped. They compared notes about good hunting grounds and easy targets, and several of them had mentioned, in conversations she overheard, their admiration for Blackwood's crew and their expressed intention to use similar tactics, capturing free blacks near the border, destroying their papers, reselling them. These men were not just potential murderers. They were enthusiastic students of murder, eager to replicate the atrocities that had killed Mercy. So Dorcas decided they needed to die too. Her methods became more sophisticated. She created traps along multiple routes between Houston, Galveston, and San Antonio. She learned to identify slave catchers by their horses, their clothing, their equipment. They had a distinctive look, arrogant and heavily armed. She began targeting them specifically, creating concentrated trap zones in areas where slave catchers frequently traveled, but ordinary travelers rarely went. October became a killing month. 9 more slave catchers died from what appeared to be accidental puncture wounds that led to infection, tetanus, or blood poisoning. The deaths occurred in scattered locations across southeast Texas, always in darkness, always appearing completely accidental. By mid-October, the slave-catching community began to notice. 19 men dead in 6 weeks from similar causes was statistically impossible to ignore. Panic spread through their ranks. Some blamed bad water. Some blamed a curse. Some blamed contaminated whiskey. The more superstitious ones whispered about hoodoo and conjure, about angry spirits of dead slaves seeking vengeance. But no one blamed a 34-year-old enslaved washerwoman, because no one could conceive that such a person was capable of systematic, intelligent, ruthlessly executed revenge. Dorcas continued through late October. She expanded her trap zones to areas farther from Houston, traveling under the pretense of delivering laundry to clients in other towns. She set traps near Galveston, near Beaumont, near Victoria. She killed 12 more men in the last 2 weeks of October. Her tactics evolved with experience. She learned that combining multiple sharp objects in a single trap zone increased lethality. A person who stepped on one thorn and jerked their foot away would inevitably step on 3 more. She learned that placing traps on both sides of narrow paths eliminated escape routes. She learned that traps placed near water sources were most effective because men and horses naturally slowed down and paid less attention to the ground. She also learned something unexpected. She felt no guilt, no remorse, no hesitation. The woman who had raised a daughter with love and hope and dreams was gone. In her place was something colder, something that understood that mercy was a luxury enslaved people could not afford. By November 1st, 31 slave catchers were dead. The surviving ones were terrified. Several abandoned the profession entirely, fleeing to other states or switching to less dangerous work. Others traveled only in large groups, heavily armed, constantly watching the ground. The business of slave catching in southeast Texas ground nearly to a halt. On November 7, 1859, Dorcas claimed her final victims. 7 slave catchers, traveling together for safety, made camp near the Brazos River. Dorcas had followed them for 2 days, observing their routines. She knew that they relieved themselves in a grove of trees 50 yards from camp, always at dawn, usually 1 or 2 at a time. She spent the entire night before their planned departure planting thorns throughout the grove. Hundreds of them, covering every square foot of ground, positioned in the leaves and grass where dawn's weak light would not reveal them. She created a killing field. At dawn, 4 of the men walked into the grove. They stepped on thorns immediately, dozens of thorns, puncturing through their boots and into their feet. They screamed and tried to run back to camp, but every step drove more thorns deeper or landed on new ones. One man fell forward and caught himself with his hands, driving thorns into his palms and wrists. Another man fell backward and landed on thorns that pierced his back and legs through his clothing. The other 3 men in camp ran to help their companions and stepped on thorns themselves. Within 5 minutes, all 7 men were injured, bleeding, contaminated with filth, and terrified beyond reason. They made it back to Houston 3 days later, fevered and delirious. 4 died within a week from tetanus or sepsis. The other 3 survived but were crippled, their feet permanently damaged, and they left Texas immediately after recovering enough to travel. 38 dead, dozens more crippled or driven from the profession. The slave-catching business in southeast Texas was functionally destroyed for more than a year. And still, no one suspected Dorcas Miller. How could they? She was just an enslaved washerwoman, apparently simple, always smiling, always obedient. The idea that she possessed the intelligence, the strategic thinking, and the absolute ruthlessness to execute a months-long assassination campaign was literally inconceivable to the white supremacist mind. But the black community knew. They did not speak of it openly. That would have meant her death, but they knew. Word spread through the underground networks in whispers and coded spirituals. The washerwoman became a legend in the quarters and kitchens and fields. Stories were told of a woman who had transformed grief into justice, who had weaponized the very assumptions of white supremacy against its enforcers. Samuel knew too, though Dorcas never confirmed it directly. He noticed her nighttime absences. He noticed the careful way she washed certain items of clothing and burned others. He noticed the coldness that had replaced the warmth he had loved. He understood what she had done, and he understood why, and he never asked her to explain because there was nothing to explain. Their daughter was dead. Justice had been served. What else mattered? The killings stopped in November of 1859. Dorcas resumed her normal life, or what appeared to be normal life. She worked at Ashford's store. She washed clothes. She attended church services in the quarters. She was silent and efficient, and apparently content. But the slave-catching community never fully recovered in southeast Texas. The 38 deaths created a legacy of fear that persisted for years. Slave catchers from other states refused to operate in the region. citing rumors of cursed ground and vengeful spirits. The few who continued working adopted elaborate precautions, traveling only during daylight, carefully examining every step, refusing to work alone. The number of enslaved people who successfully escaped to Mexico increased dramatically in the year following Dorcas's campaign. With fewer slave catchers operating and those remaining thoroughly frightened and cautious, the route south became significantly safer. It was estimated that more than 300 enslaved people reached freedom in Mexico during 1860, compared to fewer than 100 in 1858. Dorcas lived to see the Civil War begin in 1861. Union forces occupied Galveston in 1862, and the enslaved people in the region began experiencing the chaotic beginnings of freedom as Confederate control weakened. Cornelius Ashford, bankrupted by the war and increasingly sympathetic to abolitionist ideas, freed Dorcas in January of 1863, 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. She remained in Houston for the rest of her life, working as a professional washerwoman for freed black families and white families who treated her with respect. Samuel continued his carpentry work until his death in 1872. They never had another child. They never spoke openly about Mercy's death or what followed. The pain was too deep, and the truth was too dangerous even after emancipation. Dorcas Miller died in 1891 at age 66, surrounded by friends and members of Houston's black community who revered her as an elder and advisor. Her obituary in the Houston Colored Informer, one of the city's black newspapers, described her as a woman of quiet dignity and unshakable strength who survived the horrors of slavery and built a life of purpose and service in freedom. It did not mention the 11 nights in autumn of 1859 when she had transformed thorns and glass into instruments of justice, but the story survived in oral tradition, passed down through generations of black Texans. The details shifted and changed over time. Some versions said she killed 50 men, others said 100, but the core truth remained. An enslaved woman, armed with nothing but intelligence and determination, had systematically destroyed a network of slave catchers and created a corridor of safety for freedom seekers. The story reached wider audiences in the 1930s, when historians conducting interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of the Federal Writers Project recorded several versions of the tale. These accounts described a washerwoman in Houston who set traps for slave catchers and noted that nobody ever proved nothing, but the killings stopped when she wanted them to stop, and that told you everything you needed to know. Modern historians have attempted to verify the events with mixed results. Death records from Harris County, Texas, show an unusual cluster of fatalities from lockjaw and blood poisoning in autumn of 1859, with at least 23 documented cases among white men described in census records as slave catchers or patrollers. The actual number was likely higher, as many deaths in frontier Texas went unrecorded, especially in rural areas. No direct evidence links these deaths to Dorcas Miller specifically, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. She lived in Houston during the relevant period. Her daughter Mercy died under circumstances matching the oral tradition. The deaths occurred in locations along routes Dorcas was known to travel, and the killings stopped in November of 1859. Exactly when the oral tradition claims they stopped. Whether Dorcas Miller personally killed 38 slave catchers, or whether she killed fewer, whether she acted alone or had help, whether the story is exactly accurate or somewhat embellished, these questions may never be definitively answered. But the essential truth of the story is indisputable. During the autumn of 1859, a wave of deaths swept through the slave-catching community in southeast Texas. The deaths appeared accidental, but followed suspicious patterns, and the killings terrorized slave catchers so effectively that their business was crippled for years. And in the quarters and kitchens and fields where enslaved people whispered stories of resistance, everyone knew who was responsible. They knew that a woman named Dorcas had loved her daughter, had lost her daughter to unspeakable violence, and had responded with calculated, methodical, absolutely effective revenge. They knew that she had used the silly trick of concealed sharp objects, something so simple that white people laughed when they heard about it, to kill dozens of armed men who believed themselves invincible. The story of Dorcas Miller belongs to a larger pattern in the history of American slavery. The pattern of enslaved people using the assumptions of white supremacy as weapons against their oppressors. White slaveholders believed enslaved people were intellectually inferior, incapable of strategic thinking, and too fearful to resist. These beliefs created blind spots that intelligent, determined enslaved people exploited with devastating effectiveness. Dorcas understood that slave catchers would never suspect an enslaved washerwoman of murder, because their entire worldview prevented them from recognizing her as a threat. She understood that accidental deaths from infection and tetanus would not trigger investigations because frontier medicine was so primitive that such deaths were common. She understood that the very simplicity of her method, thorns and glass placed on the ground, would seem too crude to be considered a weapon. She was right. For 11 nights in 1859, she killed with near total impunity, and even after 38 men were dead, no one suspected her. The slave catchers blamed curses, bad water, contaminated whiskey, anything except the obvious truth that someone was hunting them as methodically as they had hunted black people. This is what makes Dorcas Miller's story both inspiring and deeply tragic. Inspiring because it demonstrates the incredible resilience, intelligence, and courage of enslaved people who refused to accept their dehumanization. Tragic because her brilliance and determination were forged in the furnace of unimaginable grief, and because the justice she achieved came at the cost of her own humanity. The woman who killed 38 men was not the same woman who had raised mercy with love and hope. Something fundamental broke in Dorcas when her daughter died. The capacity for mercy, for forgiveness, for hope. These were luxuries that required safety, and enslaved people had no safety. So Dorcas became what she needed to become, a killer who felt no remorse, a strategist who planned murders with the same precision she applied to inventory management, a ghost who moved through white spaces invisible and lethal. If you feel rage right now, you should. If you feel satisfaction at the deaths of 38 slave catchers, that satisfaction is understandable. But you should also feel the tragedy that a mother's love was transformed into a weapon, that intelligence and creativity were channeled into killing, that justice could only be achieved through methods that would have been unnecessary in a just society. This is the legacy of slavery in America. It did not just steal labor and freedom, it stole futures, it stole possibilities, it stole the chance for brilliant people like Dorcas Miller to use their gifts for creation rather than destruction. It created a world where a woman who could have been a scientist, a teacher, an inventor, a leader, became instead an assassin, because assassination was the only form of justice available to her. The story of Dorcas Miller should be taught in every American history class, not to glorify violence, but to understand the truth about slavery and resistance. Textbooks sanitize slavery, presenting it as a tragic but ultimately resolved period in American history. They focus on white abolitionists and ignore the daily, dangerous, creative resistance of enslaved people themselves. They present enslaved people as passive victims waiting for white saviors, rather than as active agents fighting for their own liberation. Dorcas Miller was not waiting for a white savior. She was the savior, the judge, the executioner. She looked at a system of oppression that had murdered her daughter and concluded correctly that legal justice was impossible. So she created her own justice, and in doing so, she saved hundreds of lives by making the escape routes to Mexico safer. Her story challenges comfortable narratives about nonviolent resistance and moral high ground. Dorcas did not turn the other cheek. She did not forgive her enemies. She did not wait for legal reforms or changed hearts. She identified the men who had destroyed her family, and she killed them efficiently and without mercy. Was this morally justified? That question has no simple answer. What we can say definitively is that it was effective, and that effectiveness mattered to the 300 enslaved people who reached freedom in Mexico because slave catchers were too frightened to pursue them. The silly trick that Dorcas used, concealed sharp objects, seems almost absurdly simple compared to the elaborate plots and weapons we associate with effective violence. But this simplicity was its greatest strength. Thorns and glass required no special skills to create, no suspicious purchases, no incriminating evidence. The traps left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no clear causation. Even if someone had suspected murder, proving it would have been impossible with the forensic science of the 1850s. This is a crucial lesson about resistance. The most effective methods are often the simplest, the least obvious, the ones that powerful people dismiss as too crude to matter. Slave catchers carried guns and knives and operated under the protection of law, but they died from thorns in the dark. All their weapons and legal immunity were useless against an opponent they could not see, could not anticipate, and would not have recognized as an opponent if she had been standing directly in front of them. Dorcas Miller stood in front of them constantly. She washed their clothes. She sold them supplies at Ashford's store. She smiled and appeared simple and was always polite. And they never saw her, never understood what she was, never recognized the intelligence and rage that moved behind her carefully constructed mask of obedience. This invisibility was both her weapon and her tragedy. To survive as an enslaved person with intelligence meant hiding that intelligence every moment of every day. It meant appearing less capable than you were, accepting disrespect without reaction, enduring daily humiliations that would destroy a person in free society. The psychological cost of this constant performance was immense, and it was a cost paid by millions of enslaved people throughout the history of American slavery. When we remember Dorcas Miller, we should remember not just her courage and effectiveness as a killer, but the lifetime of performance that taught her how to be invisible, and the unspeakable grief that finally made that invisibility into a weapon. We should remember Mercy, the 16-year-old girl who died 3 miles from freedom calling for her mother. We should remember the $800, 23 years of Samuel's freedom spent to purchase papers that were torn up by men who faced no consequences. We should remember the thousands of other Mercies whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded, who died in the machinery of slavery while the nation that proclaimed all men are created equal looked away. And we should recognize that Dorcas Miller's story is not ancient history. She died in 1891, just 134 years ago. People alive today had grandparents who could have met her. The structures of oppression she fought against, white supremacy, legal immunity for violence against black people, the presumption of black inferiority, did not end with slavery. They evolved, adapted, and persist in modified forms today. Mass incarceration, police brutality, economic inequality, voter suppression, these are not separate issues from slavery, but rather its descendants, its legacy, its continued manifestation in American society. When we honor Dorcas Miller's resistance, we should also recognize that the fight she waged is not over. The tactics have changed. The legal frameworks have evolved, but the fundamental battle for black liberation and equality continues. What would Dorcas Miller think of America in 2025? Would she be proud of the progress made? Would she be frustrated by how much has not changed? Would she be angry that her brilliant, determined, ruthless resistance had to happen at all? All of these, probably. And she would likely tell us that remembering is not enough, that honoring the dead requires continuing their fight, adapting their courage and intelligence to the battles of our own time. The 11 nights in autumn of 1859, when Dorcas Miller transformed thorns into instruments of justice, represent a moment when an enslaved woman looked at an impossible situation and refused to accept impossibility. She saw men who believed themselves untouchable, and she touched them with thorns and glass, and the patient, methodical application of intelligence to the problem of killing 38 people without being caught. She succeeded completely. She killed them all. She was never caught, never charged, never punished. She lived 59 years as a free woman, respected in her community, honored as an elder. Justice of a sort was achieved, but let us never forget the cost. Let us never romanticize the necessity that transformed a mother into a mass murderer. Let us never celebrate violence without acknowledging that Dorcas Miller's brilliance and courage should have been applied to building rather than destroying, to teaching rather than killing, to living rather than surviving. The fact that she had to kill to protect her community is not a testament to her strength, though she was strong. It is a testament to the absolute moral bankruptcy of the society that made such violence necessary. It is an indictment of every white person who participated in or benefited from slavery. It is evidence of America's original sin and its continuing consequences. Remember Dorcas Miller. Tell her story, honor her courage, but also remember why her courage was necessary, and commit yourself to building a world where no mother ever again has to watch her daughter die 3 miles from freedom, and no woman ever again has to transform love into death, because death is the only justice available. The thorns are still there, invisible in the grass, waiting. Not literal thorns, Dorcas Miller's traps have long since decayed, but metaphorical ones, the thorns of unresolved injustice, historical trauma, and structural racism. They puncture our society in ways we often cannot see until we step on them and feel the wound. Perhaps the real legacy of Dorcas Miller is not the 38 slave catchers she killed, but the question she forces us to answer. What are we doing to remove the thorns? What are we doing to ensure that the desperate acts of resistance she embodied become unnecessary? What are we building to honor the dead and protect the living? These questions have no easy answers, but they must be asked, and we must struggle with them honestly if Dorcas Miller's suffering and rage and brilliant, terrible vengeance are to mean anything beyond one woman's private war against evil. 11 nights in Texas, 38 dead, one mother's justice. Remember it, learn from it, and never, ever forget that it should not have had to happen at all.